The Lady Aviator, written and read by Malcolm Cowper. It was love at first sight. As the tiny silver biplane looped and dived and spun in an aerial ballet, 13-year-old Margaret Evans watched spellbound. She had never seen anything so thrilling. She could scarcely breathe when finally the aircraft climbed vertically upwards, higher and higher, until the propeller could no longer capture enough air to maintain the momentum, and the machine flipped onto its back and, the engine now dead, fluttered to the ground like a falling leaf. Horrified, Margaret waited for the inevitable explosion as it hit the ground. But the pilot was fully in control. Just as disaster seemed inevitable, the engine burst back into life, and the plane pulled out of the dive, swooped up once more into the blue sky, looped a graceful loop, and came back to Earth in a perfect three-point landing. Yet this was not the climax of the experience for Margaret. The plane taxied right up to the applauding spectators, and out jumped the pilot, wearing a white flying suit and a helmet which, once pulled off, released a cascade of auburn curls. "The pilot's a woman!" gasped Margaret. At that moment her passion for flying was born. All the way home from the air show she could think of nothing else but learning to fly. Her father had taken her to the Hendon Air Display as a birthday treat, more, if the truth be told, for his own pleasure than his daughter's. Her response to the suggestion that they go there had been lukewarm. Aeroplanes are for boys. So he was not only astonished but horrified when she said she now wanted to be a pilot. This was, after all, 1932, and in those days flying was almost exclusively a male occupation. "But Daddy," she protested, "that woman's a pilot." "Yes, dear, but only rich women can fly. I couldn't possibly afford to pay for you to have lessons." But the genie was out of the bottle. Margaret could now think of nothing but flying. She devoured aviation books and magazines. Not for her the conventional literary tastes of teenage girls. Not Black Beauty, but Biggles was her reading matter of choice. Amy Johnson and Amelia Earhart, boldly flying across vast oceans to set new records, were her heroines. One day she spotted a classified advert in the Aeroplane magazine. The Guild of Lady Aviators is offering flying scholarships to women over 16 who wish to obtain a private pilot's license. Apply in writing to, and there followed an address in London. Having just turned 16, and without telling her parents, Margaret wrote off immediately, and 3 weeks later came the eagerly anticipated letter inviting her to attend an interview in London. However, the final sentence read, "As you are under 21, you will need your parents' consent to learn to fly." Therein lay the rub. Her father would not hear of her learning to fly. He wanted her to go to secretarial college and get an office job. Her mother agreed, with the rider that secretarial work was only an interim occupation until she found a husband. For both parents, flying was completely off the agenda. "Besides," said her father, "what would you do if you got your pilot's license? Nobody would employ you because you're a woman. And you certainly wouldn't be able to join a flying club. It'd be far too expensive." Margaret knew in her heart that he was right, but the urge to fly was now an obsession. She was nothing if not persistent, and eventually her father relented, on condition that she attend secretarial college once she had her license and devote herself entirely to an office career. Her mother objected on the grounds that she would probably crash and kill herself, but she respected her husband's authority, and Margaret, deliriously happy, set off for the interview. "You do realise," said the starchy lady who chaired the selection panel, "that learning to fly involves a lot more than just flying around in an aeroplane. You will also have to learn about navigation, meteorology, theory of flight, aviation law, and much more. Are you prepared to do all that studying?" "Oh yes," replied Margaret. "As a matter of fact, I've studied most of it already." A few searching questions from the astonished panel revealed that this was no idle boast. Her hours perusing aviation books and magazines had given her a thorough grounding in all aspects of the subject. A few days after the interview came a letter informing her that she had been successful and she was to report to her local flying club the following month. Margaret was ecstatic. A student pilot normally flies solo after 15 hours with the instructor, but after 7.5 hours, Margaret's tutor got out and said, "Right, girl, off you go. Enjoy your first solo and don't forget to check for crosswinds when you land." Margaret was thrilled and terrified in equal measure. Her life was now literally in her hands. If she made a mistake, there was nobody behind her to come to her aid. But as soon as she opened the throttle and felt the aircraft surge forward and soar into the air, all fear vanished. The next half hour was pure ecstasy. At 3,000 feet she levelled out and gazed down in rapture on a miniature landscape of fields, woods, hills, villages, roads and rivers. She was so mesmerized that for a few fearful minutes she completely lost her bearings. How ignominious it would be to have to do an emergency landing in a field on her first solo. Just as she was starting to panic, she spotted a large hangar in the distance and headed with total concentration back to the airfield. Her landing was a little bumpy, but apart from that, her flight had been flawless. The next 15 hours were spent flying solo. Every minute in the air was pure joy, and with each flight her confidence grew. But when her 15 hours came to an end, she felt utterly bereft. She was now a qualified pilot, yet she could not carry on flying. Had she been a man, the next step would have been an application to the RAF or to a civil airline. Neither of these options was open to her as a woman. Margaret now had no choice but to keep her end of the bargain with her father and enrol on a secretarial course and, once qualified, seek dreary office employment. Yet she never lost her passion for flying. At weekends she volunteered to help out at the flying club with odd jobs and was occasionally allowed a few minutes in the air. It was on one of these weekends that she met a young man called Hugh, and it soon became obvious that he shared her passion for aircraft. They became friends, and before long they were engaged. She could not have put her hand on her heart and said she truly loved him, but he was fun, and she enjoyed sharing her interest with him. At least it stopped her mother constantly hinting that she should be looking for a husband. However, before they got as far as marriage, the Second World War broke out. Hugh volunteered for the RAF and was selected immediately. Margaret was pleased for him, but at the same time furious that she, also a fully trained pilot, was barred from applying. Then one day she heard on the news an item that set her heart racing. An organisation called the Air Transport Auxiliary was being set up to ferry new aircraft from the factories to the airfields, thus freeing up the RAF's frontline pilots. It would employ civilian pilots who were too old for operational flying, as well as, and here Margaret's eyes lit up, suitably qualified women. She lost not a moment in applying, and after an interview at the Air Ministry was accepted. At long last, she was going to be able to fly again. After 3 months' advanced training, Margaret was posted to a delivery unit close to the main aircraft factories in the Midlands. It was then that she realised that her flying skills would be tested to the limits. She would have to fly every type of aeroplane, from Spitfires to Lancaster bombers, and all she would have by way of preparation would be a copy of the pilot's notes for that aircraft. She would have no radio, no navigator. Yet despite this, she always managed to find her destination, and she soon got used to being greeted as she climbed out of the aircraft with, "Where's the pilot?" and with a look of utter disbelief when she said, "I'm the pilot." The 5 years that Margaret spent in the ATA were among the happiest of her life, but it was by no means a risk-free job. Bad weather caused many pilots to crash land, often fatally, and they sometimes had moments of real terror when they were fired at by trigger-happy anti-aircraft gunners. She greatly enjoyed the camaraderie of the other pilots, and their off-duty hours often found them at parties, dances or pubs. Although the ATA was a civilian organisation, the pilots wore an attractive dark blue uniform, which made the girls a magnet for the local males. Margaret went on many dates, but she never allowed them to become serious. Flying was the focus of her life. Hugh's letters had stopped coming after he was posted to North Africa, and she later learned he'd met somebody else. She was hurt, but not heartbroken. When the war came to an end, the ATA was disbanded, and Margaret once again faced the bleak prospect of returning to office work. She applied for one flying job after another, but despite the hundreds of hours she had clocked up on all sorts of aircraft, the doors to her were firmly closed. Besides, there were hundreds of redundant male pilots all looking for work, so she really had no chance. But one day an idea occurred to her. If she could not fly, she could at least write about flying. She had always enjoyed writing at school, so she decided to write a book about her wartime service. To her astonishment, it was an instant bestseller. The public, it seemed, had a real appetite for a story about these brave women pilots. No doubt the alluring title, A Spitfire Girl, gave sales a considerable boost. She then wrote a series of follow-ups, and they too were a huge success. Suddenly she found herself well off, and then another idea occurred to her. She could buy her own aeroplane and join a flying club, the very thing her father had said she would never be able to afford to do. It happened that at that time the Air Ministry was replacing the Tiger Moth, the sturdy little biplane in which all pilots during the war had done their initial training, with something more suitable to the jet age, and was selling them off at rock-bottom prices. Margaret bought one and had it painted silver, like the one that had thrilled her at the air show all those years ago. But her ambition did not stop there. Why not, she thought, open a flying school just for women? She called it the School for Lady Aviators, and before long had a waiting list of potential students eager to learn to fly in an atmosphere free of male prejudice. When she wasn't instructing, Margaret devoted her time to campaigning tirelessly for the right of women to be pilots. It was one of the happiest days of her life when American Airlines announced that they were accepting women for pilot training. She knew the battle had been won, for another airline would surely follow. Thanks to the likes of Margaret, who proved that women were as capable of flying aeroplanes as men, the doors were being thrown open. How thrilled she was to eventually see women flying jet fighters around the sky with all the grace and elegance of the woman in her little silver biplane all those years ago.